Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Development Insights podcast, where we bring you ideas, experiences, and insights about the real estate development industry. My name is Payam Nursalehi, and I'm your host here. My guest for this episode is Dr. Morteza Haider. Dr. Haider is a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, and he's a director at the Urban Analytics Institute. His work, basically, from my perspective at least, sits at the intersection of real estate development and data science. And he deals with a lot of numbers and a lot of statistics and a lot of data when it comes to the market, to real estate. And he dives deep into very complex problems that we're facing right now in the real estate industry in Canada in terms of housing supply, interest rates, and how different factors play against each other in some cases and cause issues and significant issues for us as a people and also for government as policymakers. We talk about managing the supply and demand on the housing market. We talk about some interesting statistics on labor productivity and how it might not be exactly what you think the issue with the labor. It might not be the issue that all of us have been thinking, that there's not enough skilled labor. There might be other systematic issues and barriers that are slowing down our supply of the housing. And we also talk about some of the historical trends in the market, in the housing market, how the market changed and the changes that happened in the 80s in the supply of the housing, especially in Toronto, and maybe some of the lessons we can learn from them. And toward the end of this discussion, Dr. Haider talks about the potential impact of AI. As I'm sure you've heard, over the past couple of years, AI has been penetrating different aspects of our lives in different forms, and real estate development and investment is definitely not an exception. We're expecting to see more of it and more prominent role for AI to be happening in the next few years. And we do touch on that and some of the potentials and some of the complexities that it will bring with itself. We also talk about some urban planning and the role of density in pricing. We talk about the feasibility and the barriers to building more mid-rise buildings in Toronto and GTA. It's an interesting conversation. I learned a lot of data and a lot of numbers that we talk in this episode. As always, you can find more information about our guest and this episode on our website, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. That's all one phrase, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. And I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. Please remember to subscribe to the show. Thank you. Hi, Morteza. How are you doing?
Hi. Very well, thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. Very much appreciate your time. And why don't we start with a little bit of an introduction. Dr. Morteza Haider. And you are currently working mainly in University of formerly Ryerson, now Toronto Metropolitan. And yeah, maybe give us a little bit of background. Where did you start? How did you get here? And what are you currently working on? And then we'll go on with some other questions.
Sure. I am a professor in the Department of Real Estate Management in the Ted Rogers School of Management at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson University. I'm also the director of the Urban Analytics Institute. And before I came to Toronto Metropolitan, I was a professor of infrastructure engineering and land development at McGill University. That's where I started my academic career. As soon as I finished my doctorate, I went to McGill as an assistant professor. From there to Ryerson, and then now Toronto Metropolitan. Currently, I'm serving as the associate dean of graduate programs. My area of research lies at the intersection of transportation, planning, and land development. I essentially look at the accessibility and how land becomes attractive for development. That's how I started. That was my doctoral thesis. And since then, and since 1996, 97, I've been researching real estate, mostly housing and travel demand forecasting. My way of understanding the world is through numbers. So most of my work is just mathematical models or statistical models trying to predict and understand trends, behaviors, and whatnot. And in addition to being an academic, teaching and doing research, I write a weekly column for the National Post, which appears in the Financial Post pages once a week, where I focus on the economics of cities. So that's what has been my life for the last 25 years.
Sounds that you deal with a lot of numbers on a daily basis on different fronts.
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
numbers are much easier to deal with than humans. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess you're right. They're controllable, and you're rarely surprised, I guess.
Numbers
Okay,
are predictable.
They're more predictable. That's a better way of putting it. In terms of Urban Analytics Institute, can you maybe elaborate what is it that this institute does? What is it?
Yes. So at the Department of Real Estate Management, we have an Urban Analytics Institute, which promotes research on urban systems or real estate markets and brings in a data-centric lens on housing, transportation, land development. We have several of my colleagues in the real estate department who are research fellows, such as Professor Don Tartaroglou, Professor Kiana Basiri, Professor Youngmi So, Anson Ho, David Schofield. These are experts in a variety of fields in real estate, and varying from sustainability in real estate to real estate finance and economics and markets and demographics. And we try to bring an informed view and lens towards understanding complex real estate problems. Mm-hmm. The institute also is home to graduate students. There are 3 students who are doing a doctoral research in real estate that are there, and then several other researchers based in Toronto and elsewhere.
Right. And you mentioned complex real estate problems. Would our current housing issue qualify as a complex real estate problem in your mind?
Yeah, it is a complex problem. It is a complex problem where, regardless of what the government tries to do, the outcome remains the same. That is, that if they want to try to build more housing, they are unable to do so. If they want to make housing affordable, they are unable to do so. If people want to buy housing or rent housing that they can afford, they find it difficult to do. So all these challenges have become acute over time rather than being resolved, despite well-meaning efforts by the governments and public sector and private sector. So yeah, it is a complex problem. If you ask someone, why is it happening the way it is, no one has an answer. For example, the conventional wisdom was that we don't have enough workers. That's why we're not building homes. So we wrote a column in National Post, showed that there have never been this many skilled workers in building homes. And in fact, it's taking many more workers now to build homes than before. So it's not that we don't have enough workers, it's just that they are not productive enough. So why they are not productive enough? Why it's taking, in the past, it took about 1.5 workers per housing start in the past. Now it's take 2.7 workers per housing start. So why we need more workers per housing we are constructing? And that somebody says, homes are bigger now than before. Well, yes, but as detached homes are getting bigger, condominiums are getting smaller. So on average, probably the size is the same. But at the same time, you have instrumentation. You've got, so much computerized equipment or mechanized equipment. So, you have smart drivers, you have nail guns, you have so much of advanced machinery involved. So I don't buy the argument that homes are slightly bigger than before, so therefore it's taking longer or more employees. But the bottom line is that people used to think that there's not enough labor. Now we're showing there's enough labor. The goal for us is to systematically go through all the reasons to understand why building homes is more difficult in Canada than in the US. Look at the Niagara River. Right? On one side of the Niagara River in Ontario is the United States, and the other side is Canada. But if you look at the one side of the Niagara River, you see it's cheaper to build homes in the US than on the Canadian side. The homes are much cheaper in the US than on the Canadian side. And you're looking at identical homes and you say, why is that the case? It is complex because no one has the right answer. And that's the real problem is no one has the right answer. And that's what is causing us all such grief.
Do you think it has to do with some sort of a systematic and institutional indoctrinated friction in the system? Is that part of the problem?
I think it's more psychological and behavioral. Systemic problems arise when there are systems in place and they are determined for one outcome or the other. I think it's more behavioral. Canadians are very conservative in their outlook, in their behavior. They're not risk takers. Tell me what the last big thing was invented in Canada. Almost nothing, right? And you tell them, we invented insulin, right?
It's been a while.
It's been a while, right? There have been other diseases. But we just are not we're not aggressive enough. And we elect governments that are not aggressive enough. And we actually keep we keep bringing in governments that are even more conservative than us and risk-taking, and they come up with even bigger regulatory burdens. So whatever you want to do, we have so much of burdens that it becomes almost impossible to do this. And then also at the same time, we don't take financial risk in Canada. We make our risk capital, we take it to the US or elsewhere. There's hardly any risk capital here to really try things, bigger things. So I think it's behavioral. It's just, we like to be conservative. We like to be, bring in governments that come up with regulations that make no sense. We create fictitious barriers. Where can you build? You can't build here because NIMBYs are not going to let you build in your towns, in your cities. They're not in my backyard. And then you have councillors who are called, they're NIMTOs, not in my term of office. No way you can have a high rise here as long as I'm your councillor. And then you have mayors who have made commitments and in the campaigns not to preserve the status quo. So that's not going to happen. Then you have crazies who bananas build absolutely nothing, nowhere, anywhere near anything. So the bananas are going nuts. And then you say, okay, let's go out and build on the green. And then you say, no, this is all protected land. This is all green fields, and these are environmentally sensitive areas. So what has not been built, where you haven't built upon, that's environmentally sensitive. Where you have paved already and you can densify, there's NIMBYs and NIMTOs and bananas. So essentially, we have ended up in a situation where we are the second largest landmass as a nation on the planet, and we have ran out of land to build. If there's nothing else that can wake you up, this should be the call that you're the second largest landmass on the planet, and you have no land to build. There's something fundamentally, conceptually, ideologically, religiously, behaviorally wrong with this notion, and people find it acceptable. All these problems can go away if you decide to fix them. But if you don't, they will still be there. Housing was expensive in Canada 50 years ago. Housing was expensive in Canada 25 years ago. Housing is expensive in Canada today. And housing will be expensive in Canada tomorrow and 50 years down the road, unless we change something. And I don't think there's any appetite to change anything here.
So what I'm hearing you saying is that basically we have the supply, we have the demand as high as possible. Like we have all this shortage and unaffordable situation because of the shortage. We do have the land. We do have the labor. We presumably have the technology and the material, which we have a lot of material in this country. But it all comes to a halt because of the man-made or self-made barriers,
self-imposed barriers.
Self-imposed barriers that are basically painted ourselves into a corner.
Yeah. Right. There was a saying about some other people, but I think it's quite true for Canadians that we use. They say, why don't those people do business? They say they're afraid of making money, right? So that's what the problem is. We are afraid of being successful. And that's what is ailing us the most.
So I'll take that and I'll go into, I was doing research for this interview, and you have, like you mentioned, you have many different articles out there. Some of them are pretty sensitive these days, which have to do with the topic of interest rates and how they affect the market. Two particular ones that you have. One is that you're predicting or you're quoting research that there are going to be 6 rate cuts in the next year. I believe that's the time frame. And we're recording this in middle of summer of 2024. But at the same time, you have another article saying that, yes, the rates are going to come down, but the rates are not going to fix our affordability and supply side of things. Maybe can we talk about the rates and the effect, direct or indirect effect that they're going to have on the market from your perspective?
Yeah, first thing to know is that if I could predict anything seriously about real interest rates, I wouldn't be here in my big boat somewhere in the...
You wouldn't be talking to me for sure.
Yeah, no, I'll be talking to you, but it wouldn't be from a basement. It would be from my boat somewhere in the near Spain or Greece right now. So basically the article that you're referring to is nothing more than a probabilistic forecast by, there's a data provider that they actually can say what is the likelihood for the next several meetings in the US. And they found out that the likelihood of 6 rate cuts over the next 12 months is highly likely based on the schedule of meetings for the US Fed. They're going to meet in the next year for some time, and that's where they're going to be able to figure it out. And what has happened is that they have computed that inflation has gone down and the environment is ripe for lowering the interest rates. And again, these are probabilistic calculations. This doesn't say that there will be 6 rate cuts. The probability of rate cut for those 6 meetings, that's what it says. And that's for the US. For Canada, it's going to be interesting. I'm a big fan of a very renowned Canadian economist, David Rosenberg. When I was at the bottom of the pyramid at Nesbitt Burns, he was the deputy chief economist there. This is mid 90s. I was on the trading floor as a data analyst. There was no way he would know me from then, but he was the deputy chief economist, and Dr. Sherry Cooper used to be the chief economist of BMO Nesbitt Burns. So I've been following David from those days, and then he became chief economist in the US, I think for Merrill Lynch or some big bank. He came back and have got this amazing practice. So I follow him. He's got, I think, the most profound insights on interest rates, and so he was explaining how the interest rate cuts are also very likely in Canada, which makes sense to me. So if you ask me, do I expect interest rates to be decline in the future? I think yes, but I'm basically more influenced by people like David Rosenberg, who has far better understanding of macroeconomics than I do. I'm an engineer. I don't pretend to be an economist. I understand construction. I'm a civil engineer. I'd studied transportation engineering and infrastructure engineering, so I know a thing or two about construction. But as for interest rates, I leave it to the experts like David and others. And they are all of the view that the interest rates will come down. And if you take out in Canada, especially the inflation resulting from mortgage payments, it turns out that there's not much inflation in Canada. So the environment is ripe for it. But still, the rates are so high that it is not increasingly likely. I thought initially when the first rate cut happened, I thought that there would be a behavioral signal and people will jump to back to and from the sidelines waiting for the interest rate cuts. Now you have an interest rate cut. I would thought that people would come in. And I think I wrote an article citing research that showed that it's the expectations of the future cuts that would promote more sales. Didn't happen. And now you have the second cut, and now let's see what happens. But interest rates will encourage people. Because see, the thing is, housing, you don't buy housing with cash, right? You take it by credit. You go and get a loan from 80% to 95%, depending upon you being a first-time home buyers or otherwise. And that mortgage payment totally relies on the interest rate, right? You can get the mortgage at 1.5%. That was the case during the pandemic, 1.5% or under 2%. And at that time, your mortgage payment is mostly paying down the principal. A smaller component is going as an interest rate. When you hit 5% or 6%, the variable rate mortgage is still above over 6% right now. Most of your bulk of your payment is just interest payment. Very little is going to your reducing your principal. So again, it will take some time, I believe, for people to really jump into it. And the other article that we wrote, which was more informative, I should have written that first before everything else on interest rate, is that it was a simple arithmetic. We calculated that due to very low interest rates during 2020 and 2021, because of the very low interest rates, about 250,000 more homes were sold than they would have otherwise. Right? So usually Canada sells about 500,000 homes. In 2021, we ended up selling 670,000 homes, right? So 170,000 more sales. And then about another 80,000 more sales in 2020, which meant that Canadians pulled back, but forward buy. So they were supposed to buy a home in 2022 or 2023 or 24. And they said, I'm not going to wait for it. These are ultra low interest rates. I'm going to buy it now. So you had about 250,000 more sales than you would have otherwise. And that is where even today, after fewer sales in 2023 and fewer sales in 2024, we still have about 180,000 unexplained sales from before. So until that whole thing flows through the system, we would not see an increase in sales very soon, primarily because there's a finite number of buyers out there in a given time period. And those extra 180,000 buyers, they're still out there. They have bought the home. They're not going to come back to the market. So we have to wait until such time that the headship rate and the demand for new homes, demand for new purchases reaches a stage where sales renew. But right now, people who were supposed to be buyers in 2023 and 2024 had already bought their home in 2020 and 2021, and hence the odds of seeing a big renewal in sales is not very bright.
You have another article about Toronto housing market frenzy in the 80s and the price changes that happened back then. And I'm wondering, maybe you can summarize for us what are some of the key takeaways from that study that you guys did from the housing prices in the 80s, and how does that tie into what you were just saying, which what I understood is you're saying people basically skipped the wait and bought a little bit ahead of time, ahead of the predicted time or the pattern time. And that's also creating a little bit of an imbalance in the market. Does that help the cause or hurt the cause, let's say, in the next 6 to 12 months, do you think?
Yeah. So that other article that we wrote was about we looked at annual increase in prices in Toronto over a longer period of time. And we found out, like everybody else, anybody can find it, this is publicly available data, that in a particular period in the late 80s, in a short span of 4 years, housing prices more than doubled in Canada. It's about 150% increase. And that kind of increase in prices has not happened since then. Like, we have seen that people complain about housing. And again, because people don't have long-term memory, so they all believe that what they are experiencing is unprecedented. But that article, in that column in the Financial Post, we demonstrated simple fact that actually price increases have been much more aggressive, especially in the 80s. And then we had a big recession, economic recession in the early 90s. And then housing was in trouble, remained in trouble for good 10 years. So we showed that to demonstrate two facts. A, that this is not the first time what's happening in Toronto or Canada, that prices are out of step with incomes and have risen sharply. And secondly, the economic corrections that happened in the past, we don't see that happen now, because right now, in the 90s, there was an economic recession, people lost jobs, and so on and so forth. Here, you didn't see job losses, you just saw interest rates increase. And that slowed down the market. The drivers of economic activity in real estate and housing markets, as the prices go up and down, they could be diverse. In some periods, it could be a pure economic recession, job losses, and loss of people's ability to pay. And in the other, prices can decline and sales can stall because of higher mortgage rates. So people's ability to purchase is essentially dictated now more by the interest rates and their ability to service debt than because of the fears of job losses or income losses.
So, but that lends itself to the interest rate, so it is somewhat controllable, is what you're saying.
Controllable? I don't know. Like, I mean, who controls interest rates? I know people who set interest rates also don't control them. It's a big mystery to me how interest rates are set, because you can agree upon the general direction of those, but is somebody controlling it? There's so much discussion. People agree and they say, oh yeah, the Feds are going to cut the interest rates, and then they don't, and then say, okay, we are revising our expectations. It's more of a guessing game. I don't think anybody is sophisticated. I know where lots of people, lots of firms and big governments have big mathematical models. They could be very large computable general equilibrium models or other dynamic models. But again, it's amazing how all these models forecast recessions when recessions never happen, or fail to foresee financial disasters when they should have been able to see. I mean, look, the Great Recession in 2008 and 9, hardly anybody predicted it. But meanwhile, if you ask economists about recessions, and there's a saying that they have predicted 20 of the last 5 recessions. So these things do happen.
Yeah, that's true. I guess it's like any other social or human or behavioral related phenomena that the minute you start studying it and start talking about it, I think there's also a principle with system dynamics that says the same thing, that the minute you start actually quantifying it and studying it and basically communicating your findings, you're actually messing with the trend that you were studying. And okay, I'm going to step away from the whole interest rate and discussion and the numbers there, and let's go into the mid-rise discussion. I know you and I have had a few discussions about the topic of mid-rise projects, their feasibility, and there may or may not have been a quotation from you out there that it's something in the same in the realm of mid-rise buildings will not happen, and because they're not there for a reason. They're just, the land is too expensive. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe we will elaborate on that and go from there.
Oh, yes. So again, I have some strong opinions about it, and usually they get me in trouble. So let me say it in a way that I don't end up annoying people.
We try not to get you in trouble.
Yes. So the idea is that how planning communities, especially urban planners, view density. And my first 6 years as a professor were in the School of Urban Planning at McGill University. That's where my office was. So I spent a lot of time with my urban planning colleagues, and mostly with graduate students in planning. And that's where I learned that they actually believe that density is an outcome of their planning initiatives. That is, that if there's high density somewhere, it's because they wrote it down in the urban planning regulation. And it occurred to me that actually planning density had nothing to do with planning. It has everything to do with land. Where land is expensive, buildings become taller. So with that realization, I looked around the world and I found out that unless someone is deliberately preventing the buildings from growing taller, such as the case in Mumbai, for example, when they put in floor to area ratio, and they say you cannot have as many X number of floors. So floor surface ratio maybe of 2 or 3 means that you can only have 2-story or 3-story building. But if there are no such artificial barriers, you will notice that the height of the buildings is directly proportional to the price of land, which means that if land is cheaper, the buildings that will be developed will be low rises, and they would be ground oriented. But where land is very expensive, and look at downtown Vancouver, downtown Toronto, land is very expensive. So to economize on land, you build taller buildings. So you have the 60-story or 50-story tall residential or office towers or higher, only in places where land is expensive, and also the other physical constraint that the bedrock is near the surface, right? Like why Manhattan has so many tall buildings, because the bedrock is near the surface. If the bedrock is 1,500 feet deep, obviously you won't find many tall buildings there. Okay, so with that premise comes this missing middle. The missing middle is a planning utopia, if you ask me. And that is because they think, if we build these mid-rise housing, which is multifamily residential, number one, and if it is 3 to 5, maybe 7-story high, that's a missing middle, and that's the reason why we are in problems. And though we are building tall, high rises or low rise or ground-oriented development, we have nothing in the middle, and it's missing. Obviously, it's missing, but it's missing for an obvious reason. It's missing because where you want to build missing middle, land is too expensive. So when the developer acquires land, it's already priced for a high rise. The land parcel is already priced, so the purchase price of that land is predicated on the fact that there will be a high-rise built. Once you've paid that price, you will not be able to build a low-rise, because a low-rise, let's say 20 units per floor, you build 7 floors, that's 140 units. But you paid the land price for a 40-story building, and with 40-story building at 15 units per floor, you're looking at 15 times 40, 600 units, right? So that's where the math goes wrong. And I don't think any builder developer can fix that anomaly in math, nor can any planner, but they believe that they can dictate. For dictating such developments, you need to own land. And the only way in big cities you can have missing middle is if land is owned by the city or the government or a church or a religious institution or a not-for-profit. They donate that land, and then you can have your missing middle on. But if land economics are involved, you won't have missing middle. So the only place in Canada you will have missing middle being built without intervention from state, and that is a market outcome, that would be in places like maybe Calgary and Edmonton at the outskirts, or near the center as well, because land is not that expensive there. But at places like Toronto, any place in city of Toronto, getting a missing middle built is nothing short of a miracle, especially if the builder has to buy the parcel of land.
I agree with you that making numbers work on these mid-rise projects is a very tricky situation. But I just want to go back to something you just said, and I agree with the fact that when the land is so expensive, it really is hard to make numbers work. That being said, someone could argue that the land is being sold at that price because there's only certain limited parcels, certain areas that you could do mid-rise buildings based on the current planning imposed regulations, right? Like these recent changes, the movement of like back in 2010 or 2011 or 12 with the mid-rise on avenues, and now there's major street intensification that recently came about. How do you feel about those? Would those not open up essentially more supply on the land side of things that could potentially help push the price of the land to go down?
No, the price of land cannot go down. I mean, how can the price of land? You have a scarce commodity and you don't build on any more new land. Land is what it is. And in places like Toronto, with 200 plus years of development, the available land for development has become scarcer over the years. So the land value will increase because of the scarcity of land. And now you have, and complementing it is the demographic pressure, that you have a steady stream of immigrants and newcomers coming to it. And everybody talks about, people are leaving Toronto. The net is still, there's a lot of pressure on Toronto. There's people are coming in. And we have also, like, if we release immigration valve a little more people will come into Toronto. So that's not an issue. Globally, millions of people are sitting, waiting, praying, hoping to be able to come to Canada and be part of Toronto or Vancouver or Calgary or Edmonton, and to some extent Montreal. So you have a very high demand for new development. You have scarce land. So the land values will continue to grow. The land values will not go down under any circumstances. And if you see any missing middle being built, my guess is that it's being built like that is because the builder was constrained from building a high rise. If you tie somebody's hand and force them to build a mid-rise rather than a high-rise and say, hey, look, missing middle is there. You have to also mention that, we forced that development and we gave these concessions, and then you start looking at those concessions to convince someone to build missing middle or mid-rise. If someone can build a high-rise where demand exists, they will build a high-rise. And the only way mid-rise, you can convince them to build mid-rise is to incentivize them separately or restrict their options.
So I totally agree. If someone could build a high-rise in a parcel of land in a good location that there was demand for it, they would not hesitate to do that, assuming that they get the clearances and the permits and the site plan approvals and everything else going their way. I'm trying to gather from what you're saying that based on these changes, like we had, I want to say, a couple of small wins, or maybe not that small, maybe a little bit decent wins in the past few years. One was the fact that the city of Toronto right now has changed or reduced significantly the requirement for parking spots on new developments, which does help the mid-rise buildings.
We should take some credit for it. We wrote two big reports, one for CMHC and one for the Residential Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario. And we actually met with the former chief planner, presented him with our first report some 5-7 years ago, where we actually showed that the parking requirements for new residential construction should be lowered. And both of those reports are publicly available online if you're interested in looking at it. One is available from CMHC, the other one is from Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario. Yeah, so we take great pride in the fact that we had some say or some influence, or let's say not influence. We were motivating the public planners to look into reducing the minimum parking requirements or do away with them in some instances, because the city was already moving in the direction. I shouldn't say that we can take the credit for it, but they were doing it on an ad hoc basis. You go and you start convincing the city, saying, "Oh, look, I'm building here. There's public transit nearby. We don't need as many minimum parking requirements." And they would say, "Yeah, looks like you're saying the right thing. Let's reduce it." But then we said, "Why are you doing one-on-one basis? Why don't you just pass revive your standards and say, if you are within walking distance of a subway station, or if you are within a high priority transit line, may that be surface or underground, that you don't need as many minimum parking spots." So I think that change happened, and we were quite vocal about it, and glad to see that.
And that's great. And I can tell you that on the small mid-rise project, not having to build 2 levels of underground and having to deal with the waterproofing and bathtubing and discharge and all the soil conditions and every other thing that comes with that. It's a great, like in my book, frankly, that's a great win for a small project.
Yes, and we also argued that we should. Sorry, we also argued that there should be underground parking. Because once you build underground parking and let's say in 20 years' time, you don't need it anymore, you can't repurpose that underground space. So that's why we said if you have to build parking, let's build above grade parking the way it's in, let's say, our building where I teach and at the intersection of Bay Street and Dundas Street in downtown Toronto, floors 4, 5, and 6 are parking lot. Let's say tomorrow we don't need as many parking, right? That can be repurposed for institutional or retail purposes. But if that space was entirely underground, who's going to be in a bunker? You can use that to store stormwater, and I think that would be the use of most underground parking spaces 100 years down the road.
They're supposedly being built watertight, so yeah.
There'll be water tanks because our sewer system, especially storm sewer system, is not adequate enough to absorb a deluge like the one that we experienced recently. And downtown Toronto is more vulnerable, and because there's no place for water to seep in, we have paved over most of it. You know, the people who talk about high density, they should also worry about the fact that with very high density, you run out of this soil absorption capacity for excess precipitation that may occur at times, and it will occur at times. 100 years flood is not a flood that occurs every 100 years. It can be a frequent event. It's more frequent than 100 years.
We're seeing that quite a bit these days, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah. Barry Adams used to be, Professor Barry Adams was a professor at civil engineering at University of Toronto. And his course was this probabilistic calculations for extreme weather events. And there was a fascinating course that I learned from tremendously from Barry Adams. His famous quote was, a 100-year flood doesn't need to happen every 100 years. It can happen more frequently.
Yeah. That's true. So on that note, because frankly, I think you and I might see it a little bit differently on the planning side, but let's say if you were the person in charge, if you were the mayor, if you were the chief planning officer, or if you were a councillor, or if you had a magic wand and you could change one of the regulations that we currently have, at least in the city of Toronto or GTA, in the direction to help the process and help the supply side of things. Is there one or two, maybe three at most, changes or major level changes come to mind that city could make or the officials can make and at least help the process?
For a period of 25 years, I would take land use planning away from the cities and head it back to the province. And the reason I do this, I'll propose this, is for the reason that when prices are unaffordable, when rents are unaffordable, people don't march to their mayor's office. People don't march to their councillor's office. They march to the premier's office. You know, the anger is never against John Tory, or anger is never against Mayor Olivia Chow because housing is so expensive in places like Toronto. The anger is targeted at Prime Minister Trudeau or Premier Doug Ford. So if I have to take the blame, like if I'm the Premier of Ontario or if I'm the Prime Minister of Canada, then if I'm taking the blame, then I'll take the responsibility, because I think the municipal governments have not realized the urgency for actions to build more housing, to help Canadians find affordable homes for buying and renting. And that's the reason why we have such a slow pace of construction. And I bring it every opportunity I get. I remind Canadians that during the 70s, we built more homes. There were about 20 million Canadians in 1970s, right? Right now, we have 40 million. And based on a 20 million population, we had a smaller labor force, half the size of it today. Somehow that smaller labor force built 3 million homes from 1970 to 1979. And since then, in any decade, we have never been able to build 3 million homes. How is that possible that a much smaller labor force, with a much smaller population base, with much smaller demand for housing, we built more homes back then in the 80s, then in the 90s, then in the 2000s or 2010s, or now 2020? It's a 50 years of reluctance to build more homes. and then telling everybody else that immigrants are the problem, or foreign home buyers are the problems, or these investors are the problems, or the speculators are the problem. But we can't address this question. The simple question, I've tried to research this. I've actually sent proposals to our granting agencies, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and I've been submitting these proposals to find solutions to these since at least 2006, and they've never said yes. Every time my application gets rejected for one reason or another. And the problem is because we only see housing as a demand side problem. And this is how most of my academic colleagues see it. Oh, there's too much demand. There's too excessive demand. There's too low interest rates. So we are facilitating investors and speculators as if without investors and speculators, you'll be able to build anything. So on that same, so first, if you said what 2-3 things, I'm not interested in doing 2-3 things. I'm interested in one thing. I will take land use planning away from municipalities, because municipalities are creatures of provinces, and provinces have within their rights, legislative and constitutional right, to make such a change. Take it completely at the province level and build that 1.5 million homes that you want to build in Ontario, because otherwise status quo will not allow you to do so. Otherwise, you'll still be lagging behind the demand. And once that demand is done, once we have that supply, give it back to this municipality, saying, here, now you can do the land use planning again. But without taking that away, I don't think the impetus will ever be, and because nobody marches to their counselor's office and say, hey, housing is so expensive. You've been my counselor for the last 30 years. Look how much housing has become more expensive, and we haven't built any in our neighborhood. That kind of conversation is always, that anger is always targeted at the premier or the prime minister. So again, if I'm the premier and I'm getting all the blame, I'll fix it. I'll take the responsibility as well. But let me just explain a small thing as well. There's been these demand side approaches tell people, oh, it's because of their speculators and investors. Do you know that the Paris, where the Olympics are happening right now, and where the whole world is looking at it, you go to Paris and you look at those boulevards and you look at those Haussmannized architecture. Haussmann was the architect who designed those 5 to 7 story. You're missing middle, which is obviously present in Paris. And you go and walk through these boulevards and you're such in praise of those, and you say, how did you never ask this question? Who financed the construction of those buildings? Hundreds of buildings. And it turns out there's a very good book on the history of Paris written by someone who's a professor in England, but she was a graduate student of planning at the University of Toronto some few years ago. In her book, she actually explains, she goes back and looks at the record. It turns out that investors and speculators are the ones who finance the construction of those buildings, the same missing middle buildings that we admire so much in Paris. But when it comes to Toronto, when it comes to Vancouver, when it comes to Canada, we are up in arms against investments and investors, as if someone can invest money now to buy a house in 4 years and wait for it. You can't do that. You, as a non-investor, you don't invest in a new construction and wait for 4 or 5 years for it to be built. That's the job of investors, and that's why you need them, because they take the risk capital, the investment risk capital they provide. They take all the risks, and if there's a reward for them, then be it. Because I'm not an investor. I can't invest in a condominium of my money and then wait for that condominium to be built over the five-year period. And let's say I'm a young person, I made that investment, and in that 5 years, instead of one, I ended up with 2 kids. Now that apartment is too small for my needs. By the time it's built, my demographics have changed. Obviously, people know this. I'm not saying anything that's rocket science. And because of these demographic realities, people who are not investors do not invest in real estate for new construction. Construction is investment driven, and you have to bring in investors rather than scare them away.
Thank you very much. That was great. And I just want to, toward the wrap up of our conversation, you, in your position in a university, you're sitting at what I would like to call the intersection of real estate and real estate development, and a lot of data and math and analysis. And I would like to personally know, what are your thoughts about these days AI as everything, and everywhere you go, you see AI in applications, softwares, and there are obviously a whole bunch of different discussions about what is it going to do to different markets. I'm curious to know, in your mind, is AI going to affect how real estate development works? Is AI going to affect how real estate investment going to work? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Here, I'm actually working on an industry publication. I'm drafting something for a trade journal on the intersection of AI and real estate. And I must confess that what I'm going to say now, I may have to revise stance maybe even 6 months down the road. But I think AI is not going to affect real estate in a big way. And the reason for this is the following. One of the big companies that invested in real estate AI was this firm in the US that came up with this mathematical model to predict the price of housing, and they called it Zestimate. And that Zestimate essentially is a use of machine learning algorithms, and advanced algorithms, could be deep learning algorithms, to predict the price of housing. Right? Zillow is the company, and they had tons of money to invest in it. So they came up with these sophisticated teams, artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning teams, and they started predicting the price. And then they became very confident about the success of their algorithms. And they started a company that said, okay, based on our own forecast, we can actually see which dwelling is underpriced, and then they would go and buy the underpriced based on their models. That business, they closed down last year or the year before. They started losing money. So that was an eye-opener for me, because most of my work initially has been on property valuation, building models. And I always believed that it's very difficult to predict consistently what people are willing to pay for housing and be right all the time. But then I thought, I'm a one-man show. Usually I have 2 or 3 graduate students working with me. It can never be a match to a company like Zillow with maybe dozens of people working in their evaluation team with they had algorithms that would look at the pictures, and from that pictures on the MLS system, they would infer information about the quality of the house, like is it marbles countertop, or is it ceramic countertop, and is it a golden faucet? That kind of detail they could infer based on AI, using AI to infer information from images and then bring that image. My models would say, okay, how many bedrooms, washrooms, location, facing south or east or whatnot, how many furnaces, if there's a swimming pool, is a finished basement, and so on and so forth. So I had these quantifiable explanatory variables in my model. I still got into 93, 94% accuracy, and predicting prices, let's say within plus minus 5%. If I were to predict that price, on average, my models were predicting the prices within plus minus 5%, roughly 80%, 70 to 80% of the time. But that's pretty much where I cap, maybe sometimes coming close to 90%, but in rare cases. So I always thought that these big teams using AI and deep learning would be doing a big job. But then I saw Zillow shutting down that entire enterprise after they had some losses, to realize that no matter how much of deep learning you throw, you can't predict the future. Because again, predicting future or predicting what people would do and what they will pay and how they will value, it should remain unpredictable for the markets to exist. If markets become predictable, they are no longer markets, they'll be chaos. So the AI would have some uses, anything that streamline a repeatable task. They can do it better. Describing a property, you can actually upload 100 pictures of a building or a house and ask the AI to describe it. It will describe it better than someone with average writing skills. So you could see generative AI making some tasks easier. So they will contribute to the productivity of the real estate industry. You can use AI to do building maintenance a little better. So the generative AI will be able, not generative, but AI tools will be able to sense the information from the building through sensors a little better. So we will have better use of sensors and more real-time monitoring of the buildings and allocation of resources as in terms of heating, HVAC, and power and whatnot. It may be able to incorporate predictive analytics in operations. For example, feeding some previous data, you can predict if something would fail and before it fails. All of these things would happen. But if you think of a revolution in real estate industry, that is not going to happen. A revolution in editing business, I think, is possible through generative AI. I don't think editors will be people who review and revise your draft. That job is gone. If you ask me, in 10 years down the road, I don't expect people to say I'm an editor, because the generative AI is already doing a damn good job of editing your drafts and making stock photographs that job is gone. But there are things where predictability is involved, and that's a big part of real estate industry. I don't think that's going anywhere.
Right. Okay. That's great. And I appreciate your insight. Obviously, throughout the past decade or so, the use of different technologies in the real estate development and the design side, and also in the maintenance side, like you mentioned, both from a BIM perspective, now the discussion of the digital twin over the past few years or number of years has been picking up. And I think you and I had a discussion about this, that we could potentially see some of that maybe piggybacking off of AI and the tools that AI can bring in, which is pretty much in line with what you just said.
Yes, but I also, I haven't fully imagined the scope of things that could happen. So in 6 time, if you ask me again, probably
I don't think you're alone. By no means, I don't think you're alone. This thing is moving at such a fast speed that I think no one really knows in 6 months. But maybe we should do another episode in 6 months and see where we are and how things are going. Is there anything that I didn't ask you, or are there any final thoughts that you would like to share with our audience?
I think my final thought would be that most people in housing are complaining about costs, about prices, and the like. And I think that you should demand more. And as Canadians, you should use your vote as your tool to achieve better outcomes in your lives. If you believe that housing is too expensive, if you believe that we are paying too much for bread, you could see that by complaining and making that, you got companies to pay $500 million in fines for that. If you think that housing is expensive to rent and purchase, then find out why it is, and then use your vote and elect representatives who are not only sympathetic, but have empathy. So they have experienced the same pain as you and are willing to make changes in real estate in Canada. We need a revolution, nothing short of a revolution in Canada, to be able to get a grip on housing and the challenges it poses to us. It's becoming worse over time. Even a pandemic couldn't slow us down and couldn't give us a breathing space when it comes to housing. There has to be a complete rethink. Nothing of what we have done in the past, its repetition in the future, will deliver a solution. Again, use your vote. There will be an election next year in the federal level, and there will be elections happening in provincial levels. Bring people forward. Elect representatives who make it as a priority as it is for you to have affordable shelter in Canada.
Thank you very much, Murtaza. And if you want to just share where people can find you, what's the best way to reach you, that would be awesome. And if anyone has questions, they can potentially directly contact you.
Luckily, not many Morteza Haiders are on the web. So if you just Google my name, Morteza, and last name Haider, you will come to my website at either the university, Toronto Metropolitan University, or just go to our website, www.urbananalytics.com, or the column that I write with my good friend Stephen Moranis. It's called Haider Moranis Bulletin. It's www.hmbulletin.com. You can find us there, and our contacts are there. Feel free to reach out to us if you could help.
Thank you very much, Murtaza. Have a great one, and very much appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Just one last thing before you leave. We've created a document called Real Estate Development Toolbox, which you can download for free from our website at realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. This document is basically the result of us asking our network and our listeners, what is the top tool that you use on a daily basis to keep yourself aware of information that's going on in the industry, the changes, the trends, the technologies, the regulations, and or if you the tools that you use to make sure that you deliver quality results to your clients and customers, the tools that help you with productivity in what you do, and also any softwares, specialized softwares that you think are useful to share with others. So if you think there are resources that you're using on a daily basis and you would like others to know about them, please make sure to let us know, and we will make sure to include it in the next iteration of this toolbox. Thank you very much, and I hope you find this document useful.